Welcome to the Provoke Media podcast. I'm Arthi Shah, executive editor for Provoke Media and your host for today's episode. So on today's episode, we're going to ask this question: when CCOs and CEOs clash, is leaving the only recourse? So to talk about this, I'm very excited to have Gabriel Stricker here. And Gabriel is so immersed in Silicon Valley companies and culture. His resume includes Google, Twitter, Niantic, Google again, Emerson Collective, and now he's at Color. And I'll actually post a link to the story that we did on his joining Color in the show notes. And one thing that's always stood out to me in my conversations with Gabriel over the years is Gabriel has such a point of view and a sense of purpose in all of the choices he makes professionally and all of the roles that he takes on. So welcome, Gabriel. I'm so excited to have you here.
Thanks for having me.
I didn't miss any of the companies, did I?
I think that's a pretty good tour.
Yes. So, we are living right in this moment where people keep saying that purpose matters. People want to work for organizations whose values align with theirs. And yes, I think purpose is being used as sort of a North Star in the companies people want to work for. But I feel like that's just the starting point. I feel like we don't talk enough about sort of what happens when you take a job and realize that those values aren't lived in the way that you initially imagined or hoped. And, considering that some of the fastest growing and most lucrative employers right now are in the news for things like whistleblowers showing how, harmful their products are, billionaire founders shuttling off to space while not providing healthcare to employees, CEOs banning political conversations, companies actively lobbying to reshape labor laws, and the gig economy. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. So sort of with that backdrop, Gabriel, I'd love to sort of start this conversation about, maybe letting our listeners know about your near miss at working at one of these companies that's in the news these days. Tell us about how you almost worked at Theranos.
Yeah, I've not actually talked about this publicly before, but it's true. In 2015, and I actually don't know exactly the timing of when the Ken Aletta New Yorker piece came out, but that was when Theranos first was on my radar. And I, like many others, and apparently including many investors, read that piece and was just captivated. I had been really fascinated with that space for a long time. And yeah, in 2015, in August, September, and October, had really advanced negotiations with Theranos and was offered a job from them, I think, shortly before the John Carreyrou piece came out in the journal. And then obviously after that, decided that from what I had seen, it did not make sense to join that, because I, like many others at that point, questioned how legitimate it was. But yeah, it was definitely a cautionary tale for me, and I think just reinforced the importance of having a really clear understanding of the moral and ethical fiber of the people who you're going to work with, and making sure that there's alignment there.
So, okay, so let's tackle this from
Yeah.
two sides, and one would be sort of this vetting that happens initially, and and it's worth noting with the Theranos example that while you turned that down, somebody else did take that role, right? And
Yep.
and I'm sure there's probably comms professionals who looked at this as a meaty crisis challenge that they could kind of sink their teeth into. Do you think there are two different types of, do you think there's different types of comms folks? Like some people, you would give them this crisis and they would say, "Oh yes, let's see what we can do with this."
Maybe so, but what you were saying at the top to me is akin to, and I might butcher this, but a friend and former colleague of mine, Alex McGilvray, who was the general counsel at Twitter, had said this point, that if you're in a place where you're working where you do not have clear moral and ethical alignment with the executives that you work with, if you get to a point of disagreement, the only recourse you'll have is to leave. And so his point was not to say leave. His point was make sure you have that alignment in advance. maybe I can't speak to what motivates other people, or maybe there were other people who looked at the journal piece or pieces and said, no, 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 I really genuinely believe this. There are many people who had the experience of meeting with Elizabeth Holmes and said, in spite of all this, I believe her. And I have to tell you, having met with her at the time many times, on some level, as peculiar as this sounds, I think she believed what she was telling me. So it's a very tricky thing. I don't know what the circumstances were of the people who actually did go and say, I want to do this, but maybe they were just so persuaded that this had to be true that they did it. That's what I'd at least like to believe. I'd like to believe that that's what motivated them, rather than them believing, oh, I don't believe in this, but I'm nevertheless going to be out there trying to explain to people why it's good.
So let's go back to sort of
Sure.
vetting,
Yeah.
the executives so that there is ethical and moral alignment. Um, do you have any thoughts on how that can be done?
Let me give you like an example, not on vetting the executives, but just from a hiring standpoint. I think she would not object to me naming her, but there was a woman who I hired or interviewed at Google, whose name is now Gina Johnson. Her name was Gina Weekly at the time. And Google, as you might know, had really, I think, frankly, unreasonable hiring requirements that had a lot to do at the time with your academic performance, much more than your professional achievements. And my recollection of it was that Gina had maybe it was like a B- in some inconsequential class as an undergraduate in college. And this came up in her hiring process. And I had said to her, there are lots of reasons why people don't have perfect grades from UC Berkeley. I think that's where she went to school. And so there's lots of reasons why. And I said, I see that you were working your way through college, because I could see in her professional experience that she was working somewhere in Berkeley area at the time. And I said, that's a perfectly good reason to explain why you might have imperfect grades. Caveat here, it's insane that we're having this conversation. It's insane that that was part of the hiring criteria, but be that as it may. And in that conversation, Gina stopped me and said, I just want to clarify, I did work during college, but I did not work I wouldn't feel comfortable with you characterizing it that I worked my way through college. Those are two different things. And I worked because I wanted to have extra money, but it wasn't like I was in need of that in order to finance my education. That, for me, there are very few times where someone can sort of prove their moral and ethical fiber to you through an interview.
Yeah.
At that point, I was going to throw my body on the tracks to ensure that she got hired, because my point was, here we know this person's character. She has just revealed to us. She could have just as easily let that pass, but was like, no, no, no. I'm a person of such integrity. It's critical to me that you know this. And if I'm going to be hired here, it's going to be in having like the right sort of context or pretext.
Right.
And I think that there are either opportunities to take advantage of it when interviewing people to like to seize on those moments where they have shown themselves to have high integrity and really, really value that, sometimes above other qualities. And then I think that there are other opportunities to just ask people when you are the candidate, to try to suss that out. Now, for me personally, I have to say, like, for all of the drama surrounding Twitter, I in my conversations with Dick Costolo, who's the CEO when I was there, the main thing that I came away with my discussions with him before I joined was his integrity. And people can debate all they want about strategy and whatnot, but that really was striking to me. And I think it's just incumbent upon us when we're joining places to try to get at that at people. And I think sometimes we're really over indexed on strategy and under indexed on values.
There's this saying out here, right, that everyone is trying to strike it rich in tech so that they never have to work in tech again. So, if that's what's guiding sort of the hot employment market right now, where people are looking, I mean, I've had it described to me by folks, like folks in ad tech, for instance, as like it's a gold rush, right? It's a gold rush. You're just trying to get as much gold into your cart as you can, and then hopefully you can do something good, or better in the world once you've kind of achieved some milestone. I mean, do you feel like that's a little bit of the ethos out here, and that maybe integrity doesn't factor in as much as we would like it to? I mean, there's just a sense of, I'm just trying to find the next unicorn. I just, what kind of, what kind of payout could I potentially get, that would make my life easier, versus trying to work for companies that you and founders and executives that you believe in.
We are about to have an interesting philosophical conversation. I hope that that's not the case, because if you really draw that out to its logical conclusion, what people would be saying is, I want to knowingly go into a situation where I'm somehow knowingly compromising my values so that I can financially enrich myself, so that I can then unpause and start to live out my values. And that would be a real shame, if that's what's going on for people, because and let me just say, it has taken me some time personally to kind of evolve in my thinking on this, because I will just acknowledge, earlier in my career, I felt like I was evaluating a lot of my professional worth in terms of what I was doing, and much less in terms of the person who I was able to be and the values I was able to hold as I was doing that work. Because I just think we spend so much of our time, certainly in this culture, dedicating ourselves to our professional pursuits, that you ultimately, in my opinion, you just have to view your work as yet another sphere in which to attempt to exercise your humanity. Like, it's very easy to be humane or much easier to be humane if you are sitting by yourself on a meditation cushion in some dojo. But it's much harder to be humane if you're thrown into a professional environment with a bunch of people who you maybe don't know or didn't choose and don't have a lot of experience with. Right. And it's pressure filled and sometimes have conflict and whatnot. But can you be the finest version of yourself in that context? That to me is the bigger test. And so I would really hope that that is more the lens that we can look at our professional pursuits through, because in the end, like that,
right,
I would hope for most people that's going to be the thing that's going to be most gratifying.
So there's two things here that stand out. First is, you think about, like, if Silicon Valley is what investment banking was, right, 2 decades ago, where, you went to work every day and you knew that your job was essentially to screw people over. And that did eat away at people's souls, right? I mean, you read all about the culture around, banking. It was really harmful for people, but they went in, they were making their money. And then, yeah, many of them went and opened up, a tea shop in in upstate New York or something to just kind of cleanse their souls. And so I wonder if there's some element of that happening in the tech sector right now. And the second thing is yeah, I mean, there's treating your your employees and your colleagues with humanity and integrity and respect. And I think that is happening at a lot of these tech companies, even if the product that they're making is potentially quite harmful.
Right.
It's almost two separate things, right? I mean, you can come to work every day and with integrity and treat people in a humane way, even if your product is causing harm. And a lot of people come to Silicon Valley not necessarily for the gold rush. They come because they like solving problems and they like the puzzles, and they're
Yes.
really, and they almost are able to separate what the end product is from the process, which is what they enjoy so much.
You're right. And look, there has to be alignment there. Because it doesn't quote unquote work if I say to you, Arti, this is the perfect professional pursuit for me. I'm able to go to work and live out my values and be caring and compassionate and intellectually curious and be the person I want to be. And you say, oh, that's really great. What is your place of employment? And I say, oh, well, I'm designing and assembling nuclear bombs. Like that, clearly there has to be some alignment there. And you're right. I do think there are examples of where the professional environments may be becoming more and more humane, just as the products or services become less so.
Yeah.
And we can. It is very interesting to have that conversation in the face of this most recent whistleblower example. But this is where you're right. Like there has to be a third layer where there is moral and ethical alignment with the people who you're working for and with, and that the mission of the company itself is just somehow objectively doing good. I would just say one thing briefly on this point is, I think that there was a time when a lot of companies and even founders of companies had a similar mindset that you were describing earlier, which is, I'm going to launch this company, have it make a lot of money, and finance my other sort of social good pursuits.
Right.
And to me, Larry Page was the first person who I saw who said, no, I'm actually going to change the company so that it can pursue the pursuits that I'm interested in. And so it was born that this search engine was now innovating self-driving cars and so on. Like that really was born out of, I think, at the time was just a very different way of thinking about businesses and what businesses were for. And I really, I respect Larry's perspective on that. It was very eye-opening for me at the time.
I think that's why people noticed it, right? And it got so much attention because we hadn't heard a company talk about themselves and their own mission in that way, right? Whether that's still the case at that company is right. I mean, that's not necessarily, that's obviously up for debate.
Yes.
So what if you are an executive, you're a CCO, you're at a company, at some point you did believe in the vision and the mission. Now you're in a board meeting and there is clearly, there's clearly tension and conflict around a direction that the company should go in. I've heard the CCO referred to as a chief conscience officer, and that it's their job to kind of steer the moral ship, but it just doesn't seem possible unless the other executives are on board. So I want to get your take on this idea that the CCO should be the chief conscience officer and should sort of be the moral compass of the company, because I don't know that actually works unless you have other executives buy in. And let's start there. Like, do you think that that's
here's kind of the way that I view that, and the cornerstone of it actually is journalists and journalism, because part of the role of people in communications is to engage with journalists whose job it is to, as many of whom's job it is to objectively as possible report to their readers on what's happening, in that case, inside that company. And that's a gift, if you think about it, that dynamic, to be able to engage on a regular basis with a person whose job it is to bear witness to what's going on, and is being thoughtful about articulating that in words or in video or what have you. That's a huge gift. And that just so happens that the people who are doing media relations have, I think, a disproportionately inside look at what's going on with those journalists, because they're asking just the questions that they're asking can be profound. And so I think what ends up happening is that a lot of the communications professional end up being this bridge, not just to the outside world, but to a very, very critical function of the outside world in journalists and journalism. And so sometimes what I think that conscience, with the way that conscience can be expressed, isn't necessarily in somehow getting on a high horse and saying, like, I am a person of unimpeachable conscience and therefore I am telling you this is the right or wrong thing to do. But it comes out more of saying, look, for what it's worth, I've spoken with these 5 journalists this week, and their assessment of what we're doing is this. And that's a pretty profound mirror to hold up. Certainly sometimes there are going to be people or outlets with an agenda, and you take that mirror with some grain of salt. But in my opinion, when you have journalists and outlets that are trying to do responsible journalism, then that bridge to that entire sphere is profoundly valuable. And the ability to bring that back to an executive team and say, hey, let me just tell you, here's what you're saying, or here's what we're doing, and here's how it's being received. That to me is where that kind of conscience, if you can call it that, comes in. And so in some ways, what I'm saying is you're like channeling the conscience or judgment of journalists and journalism, which is why A, we need great journalists and great journalism, and B, we need to have communications professionals who are engaging with journalists in really, really good faith with integrity.
So now you're in the room, and a decision is being made that don't align with your values. The ethics of the company are suddenly starting not to feel so good. Before leaving, like, is there anything that you think can be done at that point? I mean, probably what you just described, right, is just really laying it out there and saying, this is how what you're doing is going to be received. But I don't know how powerful that can be in an era where, I mean, everybody was, after all of the damning things that came out this week, for instance, just to use Facebook as an example, AOC posted a video on Instagram about how monopolistic Facebook is, right? But they own internet communications. Where else was she going to do it? So, I don't know. I don't know if executives, if you can build, people are building companies now where they're like, yes, we may make people mad, but guess what? They don't have another option. I've talked to so many people that are trying to wean themselves off of, for instance, Amazon because of business practices. They just can't bring themselves to make they can't cut that final cord because they rely too heavily. What you think about Prop 22 and the gig economy, right? People rely on that we're sort of in this world now where it's going to be hard. I wonder if it's going to be harder for comms folks to say, hey, look, you're making people mad about this, and this is how this is being received. And if the answer might increasingly be, well, yeah, but they're going to still use our services, so it's fine.
Let me just, I want to try to paint a slightly different picture for you of this, because I think it may be true that there are instances where something really, really monumental comes to a head, and then you have some really deeply insurmountable difference of opinion or perspective or whatever that is. But actually in practice, what happens is, in my experience, is like in many other places in life or work, is you have a series of incrementally compounding small decisions, small mistakes that lead to that huge divide. And so what inevitably happens is you have people who don't speak up, turn the other way on the sort of preceding smaller mistakes or smaller trespasses, and they all add up to something that's greater. And so in the end, what it's about is putting your foot down on what seem like the smaller things, at the time, this isn't exactly a perfect example of difference, a difference of opinion in terms of like a moral and ethical standpoint. But, you know, when at Twitter, the decision was made to go public, Ali Ragani at the time was, I think, a singular voice in saying, I have these concerns about our ability to grow this platform in a way that's going to be sustainable over time. And he was he may have been not only the minority, but the only voice in the room to say that. Now, I at the time heard him and had, I think in hindsight, some sort of blind faith in the way in which technologists can sort of solve their way out of deficiencies. But he was 100% right about it. And that was a, in hindsight, a fairly brave thing to have said in that room, because he was alone in saying it. And it was just like calling into question, I think, basic assumptions that a lot of us had about the business and the technology. And that's more of what I'm describing, is the courage to stand up in those moments and say, actually, y'all, I don't agree. And this is why. And again, I don't know that that was necessarily a moral or ethical stand that he was taking. But I do think it's an example of how those incrementally compounding smaller mistakes add up in bigger ways. And people do this. And I think that as far as kind of being the conscience of organizations, all of us, I guess, Arthi, the reason why I'm resisting this idea of being the sort of chief conscience officer is because it would be a really sad and unsustainable state if organizations said, you know what, we're all going to delegate the responsibility to this person. Everyone shares that responsibility. And I think for the most part, in my experience, I think most people do act with integrity. And sometimes folks just get painted into corners for other reasons. But yeah, I would hope that everyone is that chief conscience officer.
I think I 100% agree with you. I think this idea that one voice at the company should bear this responsibility of sort of, carrying out the moral and whatever the ethical duties and responsibilities is not sustainable, and it's going to wear somebody down. Honestly, like that's a lot. That's a big burden for one person to carry, or even just one department to carry, right? It has to be infused, I would think, within the organization. To your point, I mean, I think comms has a unique vantage that they can really help move that, the moral and ethical conversations forward via their relationship with the media. But yeah, I mean, I think it's just completely unsustainable.
Yeah.
So, whenever I talk to you, I get excited about what our industry can do and the value it can provide businesses. Now we're in this moment where, again, this is unique to the agency side. I don't think in-house is having as acute of a problem as agencies. Folks can't hire. And I suspect there's multiple things happening here. Folks are leaving the industry, they're leaving agencies, and they don't ever want to go back, is what I'm hearing. And also folks that maybe are in comms adjacent professions won't even consider jobs at PR agencies. And I've been having conversations with leaders about what is the problem and what can be done to solve this. And I would love to get your perspective on this.
That's a tough one, because the economics of the agency world are really, really tricky. And I think it's really, really difficult for agencies, large or small, to be able to compete financially with these private companies. And so in some ways, and keep in mind, it's been a long time since I have been in that agency world myself, back in the Weber Shandwick days many moons ago, but I think on some level, the agencies that are better positioned to thrive right now are the ones that simply embrace this reality and say, look, we're just going to end up being a farm system for these larger companies. And it's almost like a McKinsey model at that point, where the understanding is that you join the agency to do your tour of duty. For me, let me just say, I think part of the amazing benefit of working with an agency is you get to work on a wide variety of projects and determine what it is that you don't want to do. You might not determine what you do want to do, but you really have a clear sense of like, gosh, I don't want to spend the rest of my professional time working in financial services. Like that isn't for me, or whatever that is.
Right.
And so I do think that there are benefits, but I think the agencies that are trying to position themselves as these forever destination for their employees are just not being honest with themselves. And I think if they just embrace the fact that it is going to be meaningful short to medium term work for people, that I think would be better for the agencies and the employees. That people are leaving the profession altogether. I'll tell you, Arthi, what my fear about that is that people are looking at communications, and really what they're saying to themselves is why in the world am I going to do media relations in a world where media itself is contracting?
Right.
And that would be really sad. That to me, even if it is the case that more and more focus is being placed on companies' owned and operated channels, my hope is that people, and there are plenty of companies where owned and operated channels are overseen by communications.
Right.
But my hope is that people will continue to have interest in this work precisely because of the role of journalists in journalism. And I'll just say, against that backdrop, journalists are having to do more and more work with less and less time.
Right.
And it creates greater and greater importance for them to have people who they can go to in communications who can just help them do their reporting. That's a very precarious state, because it puts, back to just this point about values, it puts a huge, huge burden on the people in communications to be honest brokers with those reporters to help them do their work. But that is the reality for many journalists right now, and where I think having a function in which you have media relations professionals who are operating with integrity, who are genuinely being helpful resources for journalists, I think is just like critically important. And I would hope that function continues on.
You've always been such an advocate for this part of the job, right? The media relations piece. And it's interesting because, to your point, we're at this moment where people are trying to sort of pull away from that and not have our profession defined by media relations. And that's, I've seen this as part of this movement away from calling us public relations to calling us comms, right? Because comms includes like all of those owned channels, and there's many more platforms, right, that outside of media. I know at Provoke we've always pushed back against that. We've always liked the term public relations because it actually does public. If you take that literally, right, that's every single stakeholder, media being one of them. And yeah, I mean, we are moving into the world where is that New York Times article going to have the same impact? Or is it really going to be actions? Like, and what is the role of communications or public relations in terms of influencing actions within an organization? I know that as one example, like Karen Kahn at HP, I mean, she now has oversight. I think she's, corporate affairs, I want to say is her title. And she has oversight of the company's ESG sustainability policy, in part because this recognition that it's not just where a company says what, right? It's actually what those actions are. So, I wonder if there is this moment where we don't have a unified definition on what the purpose of this profession is.
Yeah, I mean, and keep in mind, like, we're not even talking about internal communications,
Yeah.
right?
Oh, yeah.
Like
Yeah.
that whole realm
Mhm.
too. And an interesting recent example, until he left Square, Aaron Zamos also oversaw
Yep.
the HR function,
Mhm.
um, which of course has all these synergies of how to do internal communications, um, and speaking to a company's culture and culture building. So I think that those overlaps are numerous,
Mhm.
but however you choose to slice it or assign responsibilities, what you're dealing with is the expression to an audience of the company, its purpose, its values, its character, and that can go in a variety of ways. And I think that that's important work. I think that there are very few organizations where that somehow just speaks for itself. I think it requires like a really deliberate focus and a thesis. And frankly, if you don't have that thesis and you're not deliberate about it and you let it define itself, then you have any number of audiences, the outside world, your user base define it for you, and it can take it in directions, that you're not comfortable with. So I think it's important to to kind of provide that North Star, because on some level, what you're doing is you're modeling the behavior and the direction that you want others to follow, and that's necessary.
Yeah. So I'll close on this last question, and that's,
Sure.
after well, kind of going full circle, given your Theranos experience, I'm surprised that you were comfortable going to a company like Color, which is in sort of the same space. Can you tell me a little bit about kind of what drew you to Color?
Interestingly, at that very same time of Theranos, where I was in the midst of negotiations with them in 2015, um, Elad and Achman, who I had known for some time, I mean, talk about integrity. Like, I had already had all of this incredible experience with them. There were several other people who were at Color at that time, who I really just thought the world of. I mean, and this is just like, note to self, do not behave in this way again. But at the time, they said, we're building something amazing, which they were. They they said, we want you to join. And I said, I think it's too early for me, which I think it was. That was right. But I said, I am incredibly interested in this health space. There is some amazing change afoot, but I'm going to take this job at Theranos. And the lesson that I took from it was, having kind of come to the precipice of that abyss and not fallen in. The lesson that I just personally took from it was, I was okay going into a really nascent space, that very few people had any understanding of, which is frankly, I think, part of the reason why it was hard to hold, in that case, Theranos accountable. But I was okay going into a nascent space. But the other part of the Theranos experience was, I did not know anyone there.
Huh.
I didn't know. I interviewed with people there that, like, it wasn't even like some degrees of separation. Oh, I used to work with this person. I'm not the most networked person you'll find in this industry, but still, like, just the laws of geometry and time and degrees of separation, I would think that I would have at least known one person who worked there. I didn't know anyone. And so my conclusion from that was, I'm okay going into a nascent field. I'm okay going to work somewhere where I don't know anyone, but I'm not okay if both of those things are true. And so, um, what to me is so unique about Color is that, I know a lot of the people there, and I have seen their integrity, and forget about integrity, just vision and, dedication. Um, I I am certainly more familiar with the space over time, but and in the case of Color, uh, it's also been borne out in these years and the whatever more than half decade since then. Like, they have actually proven that they're building and shipping software, services, and logistics, and partnering with other legitimate companies like Thermo Fisher, these like Fortune 100 companies, and helping them deliver healthcare for individuals, but it's built for populations, and it's been stress tested. That's all. Actually, there is actual amazing life improving, life saving care happening at scale. And so like I would just say like that is a much easier decision for me because I have the benefit of seeing all of this incredible work that they've done. It's just like, oh, if you live here in the Bay Area, you likely got a color test or have had a COVID vaccine. If you were in Massachusetts, they helped deploy vaccination that way. So there's like real tangible work that you can point to. That makes it much, much easier. But you're asking like, for me, that was the main lesson. It was so much of this is about having the confidence in the people in some way. And I should just give you the caveat, sorry, Arti, that if I didn't know the people, but people who I knew said that, trust me, I've worked with these people, I know them inside and out, that would be a sufficient proxy. But in the case of Theranos, it was neither. And that was, a near miss in my professional experience.
Yes. I mean, I think, that's good guidance, especially in tech, right? Because there are so many emerging sectors or, elements and companies and technologies, it's like, if it's a totally nascent sector, like, do you know the people there? Because that's a big risk, not having either of those things, right? Totally new sector. You don't really know the folks that are involved. I mean, it's a risk that I'm sure there are folks that have that appetite to take. But I think that's really great guidance. So Gabriel, I know, I always, whenever you and I talk, the time just goes very quickly because I really love having these conversations with you. I think you're, I think you're one of the thinkers in our industry that can help us move forward. And we should maybe have these conversations even more frequently than we do already. But thank you again for taking the time to come on and talk a little bit about, just from a meta perspective, like what's happening, and in Silicon Valley, but I think the lessons are applicable well beyond this sector. Thank you again, and thanks to our listeners, and we will be back again with another episode soon.
Thank you.